Hi everyone, Liz Drellharmer here, and I want to do this short video to describe a bit more about my coaching philosophy so that you can make a decision as to whether you think that I am the right coach for you or not. So I want to share a little bit about the way I think about transformation and creating change. Essentially, there are 5 principles that I adhere to, guide us towards in our coaching process. So the first one is clarity. So if you cannot imagine it, then you cannot create it. You need to be clear on what you want to create in your life, and you have to be clear on that before you can actually create it. Now, a lot of times when people think about clarity, they start to think of the question, well, what is it that I want? What do I want? I don't know what I want. That's the problem. I would go after it if I knew what I wanted. And that question, what do I want? It tends to bring us into our heads, right? It tends to bring us into our heads. And this question of clarity is not about what we want. I think a more helpful question to ask yourself is, what do I care about? What do I care about so deeply that I'm willing to get outside of myself in order to create that, in order to make that happen? And so that's not a question for our heads, right? Because what we care about, that's an emotion. So that's a question for what's happening in our bodies. And so that's another reason why, as a coach, I adhere to these 5 principles, which I'm going to share in this video. I will also orient us towards what is happening below the neck. This principle of clarity, on getting clear on what you actually care about in your life, the things you care about so passionately that you are willing to get outside of yourself to achieve them. This is a question that lives in your body. What you care about, these are emotions, sensations that live in your body. And the more you can tap into that or tune into that as a source of information, the clearer you will get on what you care about, your purpose, your mission, your vision, all of that. So that's principle number 1, clarity. That also brings us to principle number 2, consciousness. So what gets in the way of us knowing what we care about, right? Why don't we know that already? Why aren't we already aware of what we care about? We know some things, right? We know that we care about our kids, our health. We know some things, but we don't know what else. And part of the reason we don't know what we truly most deeply care about is because we aren't able to be with the full experience of our human emotions. We're not able to be conscious to everything that's happening inside of us. And so the second principle is consciousness. All 5 of these principles are related and they support each other. But really, we need to, as leaders, as people seeking change and transformation in our lives, we have to adhere to the principle of consciousness. We have to be aware of what's happening inside of us. And so often we aren't, because we deal with something, we have a challenge, we have a struggle, we want to tune it out. We want to avoid. We want to avoid being with the sensation or emotion of that. We want to turn to our phones. We aren't conscious, right? And when we do that, when we tune out what is hard to be with, we also limit our ability to be with what's pleasant to be with, right? As we disconnect ourselves from challenging experiences, challenging emotions, challenging sensations, we also disconnect ourselves from what we really care about, what's meaningful to us. And so consciousness is this practice of turning into our inside world, increasing awareness of what's happening inside of us, so we can better navigate ourselves, so we can know more about what we care about and really get clear on where we're going. So that's consciousness. The third principle here is compassion. The third principle here is compassion. Actually, before I get to that one, I want to talk about congruence. So there's 5 I said I was going to talk about. We've done clarity. We've done consciousness. I want to talk about congruence. So once you're clear on where you're going, once you're clear on what you so deeply care about, that you're willing to get out of your comfort zone to move towards it, what happens next is you also need to be in a state of congruence to move towards that. So what does that mean? That means that the thoughts you think, the emotions you have, the sensations you feel, the way you show up, the way you are, the way you be, needs to be congruent with what it is you are actually moving towards. There has to be congruence. And what I would say is that if you don't already have what it is you care about, if you don't already have that, it's either because one, you're not clear on it, or two, you are not congruent with it. The thoughts you think, the emotions you're feeling, the way you're showing up, what you're inhabiting and embodying is incongruent with that vision you're moving towards, right? And so congruence is principle number 3. It's creating a state where you are in congruence with what you're moving towards. And that, again, is a practice of working with the body. That's why I orient us to the body. And that's a practice in working with the body. The 4th principle, I mentioned it already, is the principle of compassion. So I call it the principle of compassion. I also sometimes call it the principle of inclusion. So our goal is to be in a state of congruence more often, right? Clarify a vision we want to work towards and be in a state of congruence more often, right? But we're humans. We're not always going to be in that state of congruence. There are going to be times where we fall into the trappings of less helpful states, right? Because of how we've been raised, because of stresses in our environment, because we didn't sleep enough, or whatever it is. There's going to be times where we fall into less helpful states. And so the principle of compassion or inclusion tells us that we aren't trying to judge or shame or blame ourselves for not always being congruent with where we're going. Instead, we want to have compassion for that side of ourselves, and we want to include that, allow that to be there. So why is that? You've probably heard this study. I'm going to use an example of it, but there was a positive psychology study done where they asked people not to think about a gray elephant. Like, don't think about a gray elephant. And so what happened when they told them to not think about a gray elephant? All they could do was think about that gray elephant. Their mind actually became fixated on that gray elephant. So that is the reason why we don't want to try and ignore or exclude the parts of us that are not congruent with our vision, because doing that is only going to make us fall into that trap more often, right? Instead, we want to include that, have compassion for that. So that's the 4th principle. And the 5th principle is the principle of commitment, right? You're clear on where you're going. You've cultivated consciousness. You're in a state of congruence more often with what you care about, what you're moving towards. You have compassion for those times when you're not in that state of congruence, when as a human, you fall into the trappings we all do. And number 5 is about commitment, right? Taking courageous, consistent action in the direction of what you care about, of your vision. That's the 5th principle, commitment. Taking more action more often in the direction of what you care about rather than what you don't care about. So those are 5 principles that I adhere to, hold us to in our coaching together. And that's also a reason, what I also hope I've shared in this video, is the reason for why I use the body, awareness of what's happening below the neck as a tool in supporting transformation.